Hi, I'm Chris Walker, Head of Health and Safety at Napthens H&S, and the subject of this month's Health and Safety podcast is risk assessment. I'm going to take you through the background to risk assessment, the benefits to your business of implementing an effective risk assessment process. I'll take you through the basic steps required to complete risk assessments and attempt to demystify the whole subject, one that people around the world, including health and safety practitioners, appear to have been trying to make as complicated sounding as possible for decades. Now, firstly, it's important to acknowledge that we're all risk assessors. We've been doing it for years, in my case, 36 years. And while we don't certainly always realise it at the time, risk assessment is just part of getting on with life on a daily basis. It's not that we've all been doing it for years on its own that's noteworthy. I think we've all got reason to suspect that actually we're quite good at it. Somehow we've made it through our time on Earth and find ourselves alive, online, and in a position to record or listen to podcasts about risk assessment. Of course, you might put that survival down to luck, to chance, to probability, or even divine intervention, but no matter how much those factors may or may not have played a part in our continued existence, we probably all underestimate how much we actually owe our lives to our ability to spot the hazards around us on a daily basis. We regularly demonstrate our abilities to estimate and evaluate the risks these hazards we've spotted present to us and our families and friends, and we do so without even thinking about it. We weigh up the pros and cons of doing and not doing things in fractions of seconds, taking into account the risks and benefits and deciding what to do next. We routinely put into place effective control strategies to reduce the risk of harm. We take action to either avoid the risk altogether by not doing something or finding a completely different way to do it. We take steps to reduce the chance of harm occurring where we identify it, or we might put some measures in place so it hurts less if and when it all goes wrong. Risk is something we face daily. Assessment of that risk is something we all do as part of successfully completing each daily task. Of course, if we get it wrong, and perhaps fail to spot a hazard, or fail to recognise the ways in which something could harm us, or we underestimate the potential impact of a hazard, we get hurt, we lose. But of course we do learn. Our perception of that hazard changes. Our understanding of the potential harm associated with that particular task is changed as a result of our experience. We've just reviewed and updated our risk assessment, again, without even thinking about it. Because something went wrong, we had reason to suspect that our initial assessment of that task, of that risk, was no longer valid. And of course, we're not going to let that happen again, because it hurt last time. Now, just jumping into the car to drive out to visit a client, I'm at it straight away. Risk assessment. What could go wrong? What's the worst that could happen? I understand that despite my driving experience, this task puts me at risk. There are so many hazards I'm going to face between Huddersfield and Burnley, and the consequences of something going wrong could be catastrophic. However, for me, it's a risk worth taking. I need to ensure that I can deliver essential services to my client. Walking there might take a couple of days, and in itself wouldn't be risk-free, and let's not even enter into the discussion about the trains up here. So exposing myself to some risk is necessary to do my job, but there are of course simple, effective controls that I can implement to reduce the risk of harm to myself and others. I keep the car well maintained, tyres are in good condition, brakes work, I've got loads of experience, been driving for years. Of course, I'll stick to the speed limit and I'll follow the rules of the road. I'll pay attention, and just in case it all goes wrong, I'll put my seatbelt on. If the roads are wet, I'll adjust my driving accordingly. And if and when something goes wrong or an incident occurs, I'll learn from it. Every activity we carry out includes some sort of risk, but without taking a calculated and suitably managed risk, we'd never get anything done and we'd never get anywhere. We spot hazards, we assess risks, we think about the consequences, we put controls in place, and we review these risk assessments whenever we obtain new information or when something goes wrong, and we do so without really even thinking about it. The only thing that we don't do on a daily basis is actually write these risk assessments down. Yet it seems to be this that makes risk assessment in the workplace seem so much more complicated than the risk assessment we do on a daily basis that we've spoken about so far. In the workplace, a risk assessment is far more than just a document, a piece of paper, or an electronic file. It's a process, a systematic method of looking at your work activities, considering what could go wrong, and deciding on suitable methods of controlling hazards to prevent loss, damage, or injury. Yes, at the end of the process, you'll end up with a document, but it's the process itself that goes into creating that document and the process of keeping that document under continual review that brings about the real benefits of risk assessment. The first key business benefit to putting into place an effective risk assessment process is being able to demonstrate legal compliance. You're able to demonstrate that you're fulfilling your obligations as an employer and reducing the risks of penalties and prosecutions accordingly. In the workplace, employers have a legal duty to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of employees at work and other persons not employed who might be affected by the work. Employers have a legal duty to review that risk assessment, not at an arbitrary frequency prescribed in law, but whenever there is reason to suspect it's no longer valid. And finally, if the employer has got 5 or more employees, then that risk assessment must, by law, be written down. A hazard is anything in your business with the potential to cause harm, such as injury or ill health. And employers have a duty to protect their employees and others from harm and are required to identify what could cause injury or ill health in their business. Consider the risks from these sources of harm and to take action to either eliminate the hazards or, where this isn't possible, apply controls to reduce the risk. Beyond ensuring compliance with a legal duty, an effective risk assessment process brings about many other potential business benefits. Identified hazards that you have eliminated or controlled well cannot, or are far less likely to, cause harm. If harm isn't caused, people don't get injured or ill, and they stay at work. Not only do you benefit from potentially happier, healthier workers who may well be more likely to stay with you and be more productive as a result, you don't suffer from the lost productivity, the costs of replacing staff temporarily to cover sickness or injury, and you won't be suffering the costs associated with injury or ill health claims. Often, the detailed evaluation of a task or activity for the purposes of health and safety risk assessment can also lead to the identification of opportunities to improve in other areas. You may identify process improvements, opportunities for efficiencies, and waste reduction, all of which can improve your business and ultimately financial position. Now, those of you who are experienced in risk assessment may well already be familiar with the HSE's guide, 5 Steps to Risk Assessment. But for those of you who are new to risk assessment or not sure if you're going about things in the right way, here's what that 5 Steps to Risk Assessment looks like. I always put just one small step before step 1, and that's a couple of important things to consider. First up, there is no one HSE approved master risk assessment template. But there are examples on the HSE website of what they should look like, and of course, there's a QCS form alongside the risk assessment policy and procedure that does the job. Also, before you get stuck into step 1, have a good think about all of the activities, processes, and areas of your business that need to be included in this process, and take each one of those through the 5 steps. Step 1 is to identify the hazards. Identify what activities, processes, equipment, substances, and conditions could cause harm. You might refer to manufacturer's guidance, safety data sheets, previous accident or ill health records, or you could look at sector-specific guidance, like the HSE's Guide to Health and Safety in Care Homes, HSG 220, for information on potential hazards in your workplace. Check for health hazards as well as safety risks, and always consult a specialist or competent H&S advisor where necessary if you need assistance. In step 2, you need to think about who: employees, visitors, contractors, service users, and others, and how they might be harmed. Identify groups of people, not listing everyone by name, but for each hazard, being clear about who could be harmed. There is a need for special consideration for specific groups of workers, like young persons, expectant mothers, and lone workers, for example, and these must be factored into your risk assessment. In step 3, you need to evaluate the risk. And here, your job is to think about how likely harm is to result from each hazard that you have identified and the potential consequences of that harm, before deciding then what to do about it. It's important to remember that you're not required to entirely eliminate all risks. Let's be realistic. You need to identify the significant risks and manage them responsibly. You'll need to take action to reduce risk of harm from identified hazards, doing everything reasonably practicable, which means balancing the level of risk against the measures needed to control that risk, thinking in terms of time, money, and trouble. Action is not always needed. For example, if the cost and burden of the action is grossly disproportionate to the risk. You're also, thankfully, not expected to anticipate unforeseeable risks. So you need to include in your risk assessment what you can reasonably be expected to know, drawing on common knowledge, industry or sector-specific guidance and standards, and seeking specialist support where required. First up, think, can I get rid of this hazard? And if not, what actions can I take to reduce the risk of harm? Involve your workers in this whole process to make sure you don't miss anything from a hazards perspective and that the controls you propose to implement are actually realistic. In step 4, record your risk assessment. Even if you don't have the 5 employees required for this to be a legal obligation, it's still useful to do so to assist with reviewing the assessment in the future. You need to make sure your record includes documentation of the hazards, who might be harmed, how they might be harmed, and what controls you've put in place to control the risks. And finally, in step 5, you need to regularly review your risk assessment. Make sure that no new hazards have been introduced and that the controls remain in place, they remain relevant, and they remain effective. To finish up, I'd like to ask you all to take a few minutes in the next day or so to look at where you're up to on risk assessment. Ask the following questions of your business and take steps to put things right now in order to maximise the benefits of risk assessment and avoid the potential costs of getting it wrong. Do you have documented risk assessments? When were they last reviewed? Are they still valid or do they need updating? Were the people involved in carrying out the actual activities assessed involved in the risk assessment process? What have you done as a result of the risk assessment? Is further action necessary and has it been taken? Are controls identified in your risk assessment still in place and still working? I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this recording and look forward to discussing further key health and safety topics with you in the coming months. Thank you and take care.